Good evening, Mr. Todorov, Mr. Tzvetan Todorov, philosopher writing books on philosophy, cultural theory, moral theory, culture in general. Welcome to this discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
I'm very glad to be in a capital. After living in a capital of a single country, now I'm in one of the capitals of Europe.
Okay.
So.
You've just arrived to another capital of Europe. And tell me, you've had some discussions so far with people who met you at the airport, with people at this theater. What did you talk about? What was your main subject of discussion?
I didn't talk, I asked questions because I'm so ignorant. So I tried in the 6 hours that I have been in Slovenia to learn everything I could about history, geography, culture, politics. I'm not sure I master all the subjects, but I did my best.
Did any of the answers surprise you?
No, I can recognize some characteristics of Central Europe, Central Eastern Europe, to which I belong also. I have lived for 2/3 of my life in France, but the first third, during which I lived in Bulgaria, were the formative years. So in a way I'm still a Bulgarian in France, and now I'm a Bulgarian in Slovenia, which is almost like a neighbor from the next door.
So let's talk about our common European experience for the beginning. You are one of the influential European intellectuals who almost a year and a half ago signed a manifesto for new, different Europe based on solidarity. There were some big, interesting names there. Could you tell me, do you have a feeling that anyone from the decision makers read this manifesto? Did you feel there are some consequences to this great European mind saying something clever about the direction where Europe should be going?
My answer will be half and half. On the one hand, I don't think anybody reads manifestos. So one could say they are completely useless, or they're just made to give some pleasure to the people who are writing and signing them. But on the other hand, how do things change in the world? Well, by small steps. And these small steps, in particular, consist in influencing people's minds. And you never know how this influence will arrive to someone's mind. Probably not by reading a manifesto, but maybe there will be a secretary, a wife, a husband who will read it and who will tell the right decision maker later on, you know, I heard something of that kind, maybe this should be taken into account. We notice that people's vision of the world do change. And this is quite impressive. Why do they change? Why don't we just repeat what we have been taught once? Well, because of some small changes around us, which influence us by reading one page one day in the newspaper, hearing about a single event happening far away from here. So you never know, and one shouldn't be desperate about the influence, even of very small acts.
But at the same time, Europe at the moment, I mean, in the last year and a half, has moved into a more difficult situation, difficult financial situation, economic situation, crisis of values, many people say. I wonder, what do you think, is Europe just broke, or is it also broken?
I don't react as actor of the political developments in Europe because I don't belong even to the European Parliament, where at least there is some kind of impact, and certainly not to the Commission or to the Council of Ministers. So my impressions on this are more prospective and retrospective. What I mean is I am thinking of Europe in a long-term perspective, where it comes from and where it should go to. And from this perspective, I don't think Europe is a desperate place. Of course, if you just observe the movements of the euro compared to other currencies in the rest of the world, you may think that things are going very badly. I think Europe has some positive characteristics which will help it in the long run, but I am unable to predict the immediate changes. Among these characteristics, one of those I appreciate most is the internal pluralism of Europe. Because of the geography of Europe, with many mountains, deep, the sea goes deep in the earth, in the ground, and the ground goes far in the sea, we have at least 40 states on a territory which is roughly identical to the one of China or of the United States, where there is just one state. Of course, this makes everything much harder. How do we achieve an agreement on difficult subjects? But on the other hand, plurality is a wealth in itself, and we can observe this in our history as well. Europe is the place where a wide variety of philosophical, political, economic doctrines have developed, and we have acquired the habit of confronting different opinions and being able to identify with other people's opinions. I know that sometimes we have the impression that we don't, and we are so strongly convinced in what we are saying that we despise all people who disagree with us. But in the long run, Europe is qualified by its pluralism. Now, I think that what Europe lacks, on the other hand, is a stronger unity. And this is so far impossible to achieve because the political power remains within the hands of specific governments, and more specifically in the hands of the larger countries, such as Germany and France, most of the time. And this is against the unified spirit of Europe, in which the peoples of Europe must be able to express their opinion. It is possible to imagine an evolution of the European institutions, but so far there isn't a sufficient agreement on this. It is possible also to imagine a better definition of the further objectives of Europe. As you know well, the founding fathers and or mothers of Europe
Thank you.
Were mostly interested in establishing peace among European countries because we were coming out of a heavy and long war. And nowadays, and for the generation of my children, this is a non-subject, of course. What a strange idea. Nobody wants to make war between France and Germany, France and Spain, France and Italy, or any two countries that belong to the European Union. I know that in this part of the world there was a war more recently. But it was also probably a useful defense against the big bear at the east, who was watching us in a sort of frightening way, and we had to be unified in order to be able to resist the Red Army in case the Red Army wanted to roll over the rest of Europe. This, again, is no longer relevant since the end of the Cold War. So, what is the point of Europe today? I would say that there is a point, and it is a certain way of living which doesn't exist really outside of Europe, but we don't perceive it because we are inside it. But when we travel to other continents, we realize that there is a certain modus vivendi, a certain art of living, which implies a certain equilibrium, a balance between opposed requirements, such as individual freedom and preoccupation with the common good, which are not to be found elsewhere. We also can observe nowadays a process of globalization which makes political power powerless, because the whole of economy escapes not simply the control, but even any kind of political action. So we still say that a democracy is a place where the people has the power, but the people no longer has the power because the economic power escapes any political power, since it does not belong to the country where the political power is present. But this could be corrected within the European framework, because Europe as a whole is the richest part of the world, the most important one, 500 million people, the biggest market, but also the most educated part of the world. And with these qualities, I'm sure that in a longer run, maybe not this year, Europe will be able to prove its virtues.
You are giving us very optimistic, this wider concept of...
Just a dream.
It's a nice dream, though, because in the meantime we get lost into internal arguing, Germany, France. You're coming from France, that is just before just before general elections. You have this huge debate about where the France should be going. Should it stick to this German Franco motor? Should they push this EU train forward? I actually hate myself saying this EU train and everything, because all these metaphors are so empty by this time, all these transport metaphors that European journalists that we are using for the past 20 years. How do we coin those metaphors, these European transport metaphors? How are they coined? To what purpose? Because they are not very clever, are they?
Well, we don't know who coins them. Probably people like you, journalists and influential people of the media, on television, in the major newspapers. But it illustrates something that I have known as a characteristic of literature, which is the power and the intensity of metaphorical language, which is the language of literature. Of course, the transport metaphors of politics are not such wonderful metaphors. They don't make a great poetry. But they illustrate this capacity of language to, through metaphors, through symbols, through narratives also, to touch on emotional depth of our intellect, and thus to be more effective than the mere description of what is going on. I know that they are not a perfect description of what is being performed, but I don't think it's only a question of the description. It must be also a feeling of a need. And I had a certain hope that the current crisis, the current economic crisis, would push European peoples towards a rapprochement, towards a greater closeness, because they should understand that as independent nations, I think this may be very clear for Slovenians, because they have always depended on larger nations around them. However, for the inhabitants of France, especially, or of Britain, of Great Britain, there still is this illusion of the possible national greatness, importance of the nation state. And I think it's time for political leaders in Europe to understand that the future of Europe cannot be in the nation state, even in the best nation state, but only in a common solidarity and in a reinforcement of the common European space.
But if you look at the European intellectuals, let's say influential European intellectuals, you have some people that are almost embedded with certain EU institutions, mostly in Brussels, and then you have those great independent thinkers like, I don't know, Jürgen Habermas, like Ulrich Beck, like yourself. And sometimes when we read you, I think that you are almost desperate not to lose this idea of great Europe that is actually in real troubles.
But you know, intellectuals shouldn't be given too much power. When intellectuals are in power, they usually do very stupid things because they get confused between the real world and the beauty of their intellectual constructions.
Did that ever happen to you?
Well, at least this happened frequently in history. And when intellectuals tried to direct the state, the results were even darker than when it was ordinary people. For instance, in France, in the period immediately after World War II, the intellectuals were mostly, in their majority, not all of them of course, but in their majority, they were oriented towards blind admiration of the Soviet model. If they were the only ones to vote, France would have become a popular republic the way Romania was. And I don't think that would have been a great progress for France. Happily enough, there were ordinary people who voted too, and they didn't follow this line. So intellectuals, and I'm an intellectual, I cannot attack myself too much, but still I would say that intellectuals should produce ideas, arguments, but they shouldn't have the instruments of power in their hands. And so our role is indeed to write books, to write articles in newspapers, sometimes even to speak on television, but I'm not sure that French television or Italian television are interested in intellectuals addressing the general public. Maybe in Slovenia we are in a happier world.
You are an interesting man, Mr. Todorov, because a lot of articles, a lot of your colleagues are talking about you like as of someone who's mediator between different cultures, between different scientific disciplines even. You have been talking about the meaning of outsideness. I think that comes out also from Mikhail Bakhtin's Nenahodimast, I believe he called it. Why do you think it's so important to make a step back a little bit to feel how it actually is inside. Because you were never quite a mainstream. You always closely watched the mainstream development, but decided to stay out of it a little bit.
You know, one person is not the best observer of oneself, at least not always. And I must admit publicly that I'm not very much interested in myself. This has some good sides, but it also has a bad side, that my image of myself is not a very interesting image. I'll try to answer your question. I think one of the elements is that I live in a country where I wasn't born. I was raised for 24 years in Bulgaria, which is a country of Slavic culture, Slavic language, with a certain orientation towards Russia, because we don't have a common border with Russia, so Russia never invaded us, and we have a relatively positive image of Russia, at least. And on the other hand, Bulgaria is part of the Balkans, where the Turkish Ottoman Empire lasted for 500 years, whereas Slovenia avoided this fate. And this has left also a strong imprint on us in Bulgaria. So these were my formative years. And although now I have lived for twice as long in France, I think that I still remain a foreigner in France. I have an accent when I speak French. And this accent that I never eliminated is just like a sign reminding other people, because I can't hear it, but it reminds other people that I'm not completely of the same tribe. And so to me, it became clear after a while that I wasn't going to become entirely French, but I was going to be a person with one part of myself belonging to one world and another part to another world. And instead of regretting it, I decided that this was a privilege. In fact, I think that almost all of us, not only those who live in a foreign country, can experience this privilege, because we all come from one region and move to another, from one milieu and move to another, and so on and so forth. But this helps. And because of that, I realized that not confusing the habit with something natural, normal, but realizing that it is just one habit among many other possible habits, is certain privilege. So it gives you a capacity of outsidedness, as you call it. And the other element here is more personal, not anymore about the difference between cultures, but just the difference between you and me, between two individuals. When I was much younger than now, I realized that I felt that as someone who lacked identity, and I was very strongly influenced by the last person to whom I talked. And I liked to listen to this person and to share her or his feelings, views, appreciations. And this lasted for a certain time. It's no longer so true now, but I have come to believe that it is really a vocation of our species to be able to project ourselves in another person's consciousness. And that without this, we became more limited. We don't explore all the possibilities offered to human beings. And I realized later that some classic philosophers have talked about that and have indeed claimed that the specificity almost of human beings is this capacity to feel also what another person is feeling, and not just to remain always within ourselves. We are a kind of de-centered beings. Mm-hmm. Our center is somewhere in the middle between you and me.
You've mentioned just now that you speak French with an accent. It's extremely interesting how you actually became involved very closely with structuralism after you moved to Paris. And structuralism being a direction that pays so much attention to language, to nuances, to details of the word, to the colors of the word, to the smell of the word. That must have been very difficult for you.
Well, no, because you see, when I came to France, I was reading a lot of Russian writers and scholars, and there was a movement called Russian formalism in the first decades of the century. So I knew about these things, and the French readers didn't, because they didn't exist in French. So the first work that I did once I arrived in France was to translate these Russian scholars into French. That was a courageous step, I must say, because my French was a little shaky at that time. But I asked my new French friends to read after me, to correct my awkward French sentences, and they helped with that. So I found myself within structuralism without knowing it, because the Russian formalists were a kind of direct predecessors of this attitude. But structuralism was not necessarily related to the detail of words. It was in France in particular, the major figure of this was an anthropologist, Claude Lévi-Strauss. And Claude Lévi-Strauss didn't really talk about verbal material, he talked about myths and about family structures. So the important word was really structure. That is, that there was a strong connection between the different elements of any phenomenon. And we had to describe these internal relations first. That was the major idea of structuralism. So we could describe by moving from one language to another. That wasn't so important. And to me, it lasted for about 10 years, which wasn't, or maybe 12. A certain period of time, after which I realized that this choice of being interested almost exclusively by the internal composition, internal making of a work of art or of a social phenomenon, in my case was related to my education in Bulgaria. And it was a way of avoiding the presence of the Marxist-Leninist ideology in everything, in every activity, for instance, in analyzing literary works. If I had to talk about ideas, about values, I was obliged to illustrate the official values of the Communist Party that was ruling Bulgaria.
So everything else would be almost a rebellion. Even getting into structuralism was a kind of...
describing the relations between the constituent elements of a work of art wasn't an ideological enterprise. So I had remained in a way, even I lived in France for 15 years already, I had remained in one part of my head, still in Bulgaria, still with interdiction to deal with ideas, to deal with values, to deal with social categories. And so this disappeared little by little, because by that time I had become a French citizen, I had married a French wife, I had French children, so I was really becoming a different person from this point of view. And so my horizon changed also.
I read this very interesting story coming from a writer from Soviet Georgia, actually. It describes a story of a man going to some Georgian village and talking to the old people there in the village. He moved out of Georgia, of course, after a while, and this old man is saying to him, "Why did you leave? You were the first pearl that left us. After that, many other people, important, good people left. The rest of the pearls left. Now we don't have the necklace." And then the counter-argument was, but all the pearls are still there. They're still there, functioning. Did you ever feel like this, leaving Bulgaria? You could also return back, going to Sofia to enrich the life of Bulgarian university, enrich the intellectual spirit at home. Did you ever regret you didn't do that?
Well, you see, when I left so long ago now, I wasn't thinking that I was going to leave Bulgaria. I thought I was going for 1 year. And at the end of this year, I was supposed to go back, so I was very eager to read all the books, to see all the people, to go to all the classes, because it was just 1 year. But at the end of this year, I had met some interesting professors around me, other important figures in my horizon at that time, and I decided to write a small doctorate, a kind of PhD. And so I needed to stay for 2 more years. And I asked my Bulgarian consulate. That wasn't an easy step. And then I had to ask the French government, the French police, to allow me to stay 1 more year, and then 6 months, and then 6 more months, and so on. So it was a complex story. But at the end of the 3 years, I had too many involvements in France. So in a way, I never took the decision. It just happened. And I'm very grateful to the institutions that they didn't oblige me to make a violent choice, as many other people were obliged to make. You may have heard of an artist, performing artist, visual artist, whose name is Christo, who packages buildings and rivers and the sea even, or islands. Well, Christo is Bulgarian by birth, and he told me when I met him long after that in New York, that he ran away from Bulgaria, hiding on the top of a train that was crossing the frontier between Bratislava and Vienna, or some other place of the same kind. I think he was in Czechia, in Czechoslovakia at that time. So it was a courageous, strong action when he had to abandon everything. If he were caught, he would go to prison. But I never had that. I have no heroic life to tell about. I took the train with a visa, with a passport. I took the Orient Express, which existed at that time, and which brought me, after 2 days of traveling, because the train was very slow, stopping on all sorts of stops, in Yugoslavia, in Italy, and so on. And finally, I arrived one morning in Paris a young student who spoke barely French and who didn't know what to do. But I met hospitable people, they helped me, and here I am now, 50 years later.
Well, you just mentioned the difficult stories of immigration. I was working for BBC World Service in the 90s, when the air in the Bush House was still lively with all the rumors about certain famous dissident Dmitry Markov, who was working for BBC World Service at the time. You've met him personally, I believe?
Yes, I knew him, but in Bulgaria, not after he left.
Because basically the story was that he was killed by poison umbrella not far away from
famous Bulgarian umbrella.
Famous Bulgarian umbrella.
Ever since nobody wants to buy the Bulgarian umbrellas, they're afraid that there may be a... Yes, well, all these events did happen. There was a second event afterwards of a second character who was also aggressed in the same way and who survived, but who was very ill for quite a while. So this Cold War was really becoming quite hot sometimes, and I must admit that this was always present to a certain degree on the back of my mind, and I remember that during one of these days when I was renewing my passport and had to go to the consulate of my native country and to ask humbly, you know, I still have to study. Oh, you have been here for so many years, what are you studying anymore? And so on, stupid conversations. The person who looked like totally indifferent to me suddenly said, oh, I heard you met such and such. And he mentioned the name of a person whom I met once, one evening, in a private manner. I realized that I had been followed in Paris. I must have a file that high somewhere, but I didn't want to go and read it. I thought that was so depressing that I didn't want to do it.
Actually, this story reminds me of this famous joke from the Soviet times when this Jewish doctor comes to immigration officer, something similar that you just mentioned at the embassy, and of course he's shown the globe. And he's told, just pick up the country where you want to go and live. Totally unbelievable situation, of course. And this Jewish doctor, of course, he takes this globe and he turns it round and he thinks about every single country. And he's so sad and desperate in the end. And he says, don't you have any other globe? Is that all you can offer? Do you think this is just Jewish joke relevant for a certain period of time, or does it have any relevant meaning for the modern times?
Well, it certainly describes certain political conditions which are different now. I think that you don't have any difficulty once you belong to the Schengen space, which the French are supposed to put into question these days. But you travel more easily. I remember the pleasure, I must admit, I had to have a French passport and to be able to freely travel all over the world instead of having to stay in line for hours to ask for visas of different countries which would look at you from above. So it's a good thing to have a European passport, I think. It helps in the world.
How do you remember Sofia of 50s and 60s of the last century? Is it black and white with a bit of gray, or is it colored image?
No, it has a lot of color because we were young at that time. It was a great time in a way. Although it was a dark period of Bulgarian history, but it was a period of discovering life, discovering love, discovering friendship, discovering great monuments of literature. Happily enough, there are great Russian writers, and they were very much available in bookstores, in translation or in Russian, so that we could live with Dostoevsky and Chekhov and Tolstoy and whoever as much as we wanted. And that was also a discovery, and it gave a lot of color to our lives. But also there were just the fact of discovering the richness of life. But there was also the feeling that we are living under a restrained regime where we had to measure the words which we could say in public or even in private. One of my friends from Bulgaria wrote a long narrative of his life in Bulgaria, because as opposed to me, he stayed in Bulgaria and he only left after the fall of the wall. And he studied his file at state security organs, as we called them at that time. And he discovered that his brother-in-law was one of the persons who wrote descriptions of what he was saying at the family table.
This is a very familiar story in Slovenia, actually, at the moment, one of the hot political topics.
I think there are many stories of that kind, and they were very much present in our minds.
So
also.
What does the moral philosopher think about it nowadays? What was going on 50 years ago, your brother-in-law spying on a friend, or whatever those stories were?
Well, I think that's, in a way, the worst impact of the totalitarian regime, that it puts individuals in a situation where they become like obliged to behave in that way. And this is a destruction of our internal self, whose traces are carried by us for long years after we have ceased to live in that world. So maybe only our children will be entirely freed of it.
Was that part of the reason that you decided to write the whole book on this totalitarian experience? What was the main motive for it?
Well, I think that as a person involved in the humanities, in human sciences, in interpretation of history, I have always tried to understand as much as possible of the world surrounding me. And at one point, I became convinced that in that field, the field of humanities, the field of history, sociology, and so on, our best capacities are developed when we deal with subjects about which we have an internal experience as well. For a physicist or a biologist, you cannot ask him to influence his scientific work through the political experiences he has had in his life. He better keep that aside and concentrate on the observation of his biological or physical experiments. But for a historian, and in a way I'm a historian since I deal with the facts that have marked the life of our communities, for a historian it's very important to know what is inside him, what kind of mental apparatus he has, because it is with this mental instrument that we interpret the outside world, the events of the outside world. And this mental instrument is formed by the events and the contacts through which we have moved through our earlier existence. So in a way, we can never eliminate subjectivity, as we call it. We can never produce a totally impartial, objective knowledge. It will always be influenced by the fact that we are such and such person. So I wrote, after I realized that, I wrote books on subjects such as the encounter of cultures, because I had lived this encounter. I wasn't writing about Bulgarians in Paris. I didn't think that was interesting enough. But I wrote, for instance, on the encounter of Europeans with the American Indians in the 16th century, in the 15th and 16th century, because that was such a huge amazement to encounter people of whom the Europeans thought that they maybe weren't really human, and the Indians thought that maybe these were not real human beings either. They also had beards, and the Indians didn't have beards, so they were so different in every respect. And then I wrote also on the opposition between totalitarianism and democracy, because that was my life. And again, I didn't write an autobiography, although I wrote also a sort of intellectual autobiography. But in the books on totalitarianism, I tried to study it through objective traces, material that I could find in books, in documents. But I was analyzing it with my identity of a person who lived in that world. And I think that's the explanation of why I was trying to do that. I think it's just because that's what I can do at my best.
Are these books written for Western public, for, let's say, East European public, or, well, just for human being, normal human being who wants to understand?
I try to write by not forgetting who I was and who I am.
Mm-hmm. You were researching very deeply also in the most horrible totalitarian experience that we experienced during the Second World War, concentration camps, everything that was going on in there. Do you think that each of us has got this goodness and monstrous side? Can you know how certain people will behave in the camp?
Well, I haven't been in a camp, happily enough. I don't have a personal experience of this, but I have the conviction that life in a communist country, especially in the Soviet part of the world, which does not include former Yugoslavia, was like living in a concentration camp with a mild regime. The concentration camp was much harsher, of course, no comparison in terms of violence. But in the same time, it was the same logic. It was the same idea of fear and violence as being always present there to a certain degree. So I thought that if I try to understand what was going on in concentration camps through the testimonies of those who have been there, I will better understand the totalitarian regime itself. It would be like a magnifying glass, in a way. And thus, the question you raise, the answer that I found in reading these testimonies was not that this was the reign of human monstrosity, of man to man is a wolf, or any other version of this vision of human beings, but rather that in these extreme circumstances, those who were weak and ready to abandon all moral values behaved really very badly. And those who managed to resist behaved in an admirable way. In a way, all characteristics were magnified. They were pushed to the extreme. But it is not true that human care, one for the other, disappeared totally. But it took different forms, minimal but very significant forms. Germaine Tillon was a woman who was deported to a German concentration camp, Ravensbrück, where she lived for 2 years. And I became very close to her in the last years of her life and worked on her writings and shared many of her memories. And she used to say that without the invisible ties of friendship, nobody would have survived in that camp. That violence was everywhere at every moment, and that in the same time, without this human interaction, it could have been so much worse. So in a way, there is, even in that darkest page of human history, there is a reason to keep some kind of hope.
You also compare certain totalitarian elements of the former regimes in Eastern Bloc with more recent American neocon experience. What are the main parallels that you found in this?
Well, there is one important resemblance. This is the existence of what theologians used to call messianism, the project of realizing a form of utopia, a form of bringing the good to distant or close people. Communism, in a way, was that. It wasn't the first utopia that we had of that kind. Before that, in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, the revolutionary France endowed the armies of Napoleon with a project of bringing the Enlightenment to all the rest of Europe. And the regiments of Napoleon were so successful originally precisely because they fought in the name of this ideology that was going to bring freedom and happiness to everyone. Except that once the countries were dominated by the French military, they realized that it wasn't liberation, but rather another form of oppression. Colonial regimes were very much led and realized in the name of bringing civilization to the savages and to the barbarians of distant continents and countries. And that's why so much enthusiasm was experienced by those who did it. But the colonized people didn't really experience it as a liberation again. So communism was a much more radical utopian project. Now in the neoconservative ideology in the United States, there has been a similar project of bringing democracy by imposing it on distant countries, the way this was conceived in Iraq or in Afghanistan, or even much more recently, but in a slightly different fashion, in Libya. And I think that these attempts were doomed to failure in a way, and after 8 years in Iraq, of occupation, after the elimination of hundreds of thousands of people, of the population, we haven't moved very far on the way to democracy. And
before you move on, but what is the suggestion? What should be done 8 years ago? There was this huge debate whether to attack Iraq or not. Should we just comply with Saddam Hussein for a couple of years more, with Taliban regime in Afghanistan? Everyone opposed the intervention at the time, but what was the real choice?
Well, the Talibans were protecting the aggressors from Al-Qaeda, and thus the intervention in Afghanistan in 2001, after the attacks on the Twin Towers in New York, was a gesture of legitimate defense, and thus fully legitimate, because it didn't have the project of imposing democracy or human rights on the rest of the world.
It was authorized by United Nations.
It was, yes, well, let's say it was legitimate by all standards, because it was an act of defense. The intervention in Iraq was not a legitimate intervention. It was an intervention not to punish Saddam Hussein. Remember that for the whole preceding decade, in the 80s and the 90s, we were on the side of Saddam Hussein, who was our ally, and we were arming him in order to combat Iran, because we thought that the real danger was Iran, and Iraq was our good ally. And when we attacked him because he was supposed to have nuclear arms and biological arms, and he was supposed to help Al-Qaeda. And these were lies. And we knew that the chiefs of staff and the leaders of our countries knew that these were lies.
Remember Colin Powell in Security Council showing us little trucks and
claiming that that he was swearing that this was true. But we cannot stop on that. We know now that these were deliberate lies. And the result was not only the elimination of maybe something like 500,000 people, which is more than Saddam Hussein had killed in the 20 years of his dictatorship, but also an internal damage done on our own countries. We have legalized torture for the first time in the history of democracy. Ever since democracies exist, we have considered that torture should be banned, that countries like Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, communist Russia can practice torture, but not a democratic country. Of course, this wasn't true. Democracies have tortured their enemies as well, but they never did it by reclaiming it, legalizing it. And this is exactly what happened during the war on terror that was declared all these years. For the first time, a major democracy, the United States of America, introduced the idea of torture in its legal apparatus with just taking the caution to define torture in a different way, to change the meaning of the word torture. It was like a belief in magic, that if we change the meaning of the word, well then we are innocent, we are not really torturing anyone. And none of the European governments ever blamed their allies for doing that. Not only that, but the governments of France, Germany, Italy, Great Britain, and so on and so forth.
German position was slightly different with Gerhard Schroeder.
Oh, but we exchanged information with the torturers. We sent them all the necessary data so that they could torture better their prisoners. And once they had extracted information, we used it for our own purposes. And the German government didn't raise any protest against torture, not more than the French or the Slovenian government, for that matter.
We should all be embarrassed, shouldn't we?
Well, we should remember that, at least. So, if you ask me, should we have left Saddam Hussein treat badly his own population, because this is what he did, he was a dictator, I would say that we were choosing between two evils, and it's not very clear which one was the greater evil.
If we go back to the parallels between elements of totalitarianism and neoconservative machinery, what are the other similarities that you find between them?
No, I think that this is really the one major one, and that otherwise there are many oppositions also between, not neoconservatism, but between our global ideology. But there are also some more general similarities, I would say, in a certain movement that characterizes more recent periods of our public life, in the choice of radical solutions. But they are not the same radical solutions, but they are radical. And democracy, such as I understand it, should always keep a certain measure and avoid radical choices. I mean by this, for instance, the fact that we have been under the influence of a neoliberal rather than neoconservative ideology, trying to dismantle all forms of state intervention and weakening the state. The totalitarian communist state was overpowerful. It decided about absolutely everything. It decided even which should be the length of women's skirts or the size of men's trousers. But in the opposite direction, we can realize that we are tempted by abandoning all the prerogatives of the state so that the economic agents should be able to act freely, because we think that this is more efficient for the economy. By so doing, we forget that the economy is not a name event in itself, that it is only an instrument for our global well-being, and that if the success of the economy means the dehumanization of the individuals, then we have missed the point.
Are different totalitarian tendencies also similar in the way they try to conceal their true intentions?
Oh, I think this is characteristic of almost all states, even non-totalitarian states try to conceal, but usually in a free democratic country there are many sources of information, and namely a free press. And I think it's very important that the press remains pluralistic and does not come under control. One of the reasons the European Union has been a little bit troubled by what is going on in Hungary is that it gave the impression that there was no longer any independent newspaper or TV station, that they were all following roughly the same line. And this happened in a way in the United States, but it wasn't imposed on them. It just happened because of the patriotic spirit which had caught the whole population of the country. So for quite a while, people believed that what the government said was the real state of affairs, and it had been like 1 year or a year and a half before some journalists started observing that there was a discrepancy between what was said and what was really going on. And for that long period of time, for more than a year, the people were induced in error, because ordinary people don't have other sources of information than the information of their country, to which they have the habit of trusting it.
You've mentioned Hungary. Are you worried because of the development there, the political development in that country?
Well, I'm just
outside observer,
reflecting common opinion. I have no specific information on Hungary, except what my Hungarian friends in Paris tell me.
What do they tell you?
Well, they don't feel very proud by the rise of xenophobic and anti-Semitic feelings.
Is this one of the big problems in Europe currently, the rise of xenophobic, anti-Semitic, anti-Islamic feelings? How dangerous do you reckon it is at the moment?
Well, you mentioned three subjects which don't completely overlap. I don't think that in Western Europe there is a rise of anti-Semitic feelings. There are sometimes anti-Semitic acts, like partly one that happened in France in the beginning of March, less than a month ago. But these acts are extremely rare, and they do not reflect the general feelings of the population or the general feelings of Muslims in our countries, in France or Italy or Germany.
The synagogues were burned in Sweden, the country that we value so much for its democratic traditions. The gypsy camps were burned in Hungary not that long ago.
Yeah, so I think we should better keep these cases separate to a degree. The Roms raise a specific problem about Roms in Hungary, but also in France, in Italy, in other countries. They are perceived as antisocial, and thus they...
Is France still deporting them? There was this huge debate about it about a year ago when some secret plans were revealed.
Yes, they are surveyed and controlled and expelled frequently, indeed. I think that if, so anti-Semitic feelings exist probably more in Eastern Europe than in Western Europe.
Why is that so?
Because of the different history that we had, and because the anti-Semitic feelings were the major problem in a way in Western Europe. They were related to the Nazi domination of Western Europe, whether in Eastern Europe it wasn't the Nazis in the last decades, but the Soviet impact, which wasn't anti-Semitic in its ideology. Thus, the situation was different. I would say that the xenophobic feelings are indeed the most widespread and shared by different communities, and they are very paradoxical, because we have never encountered as many foreigners, and each one of us travels, even some of us travel more than others, of course, but we all travel around Europe at least, and this should theoretically make us more tolerant towards others. But I think that one of the reasons here is that our enemies, our adversaries, are today invisible. We are losing our jobs because of globalization. We are losing our habits because of the extreme individualism of our societies. But globalization, individualism, they have no color, they have no face. They are abstract phenomena which strike us. We are their victims in a way. And people who speak a different language, who have a face of a different color, who pray in a different manner, we can perceive that very easily, and thus use them as convenient targets and blame them for what is not going well. I think at least in the part of the world of Europe which I know better, which is France, xenophobia is very much used by the one part of the political spectrum in order to collect the popular vote, which means that among the population there is a fear of foreigners, fear of barbarians.
Barbarians, yeah. This is also the title of one of your books that you've written. The Islam that you didn't mention so far, this fear of Islam was extremely strong in the first decade after the attack of September 11th. Do you think that things have slightly calmed down among the European perception towards Islam?
I think that it depends on different contexts. I would say that clearly in Norway it wasn't slowing down since Anders Breivik attacked not representatives of Islam, but representatives of the Workers' Party, of the Socialist Party, because they were not harsh enough against Islam, and killed almost 80 people, which is one of the major events of that kind that we have experienced. I think that it has not slowed down in the Netherlands, where the freedom party. Usually the anti-Islamic parties are called something with freedom in their title, in their name, or liberty. So in these cases, it doesn't seem to me that the anti-Islamic attitudes are slowing down. I would say that in France, they are not as intense as before. And one of the reasons for this is that there is more and more an integration of people with Islamic names have entered the middle class. And there are more and more teachers, doctors, lawyers, etc., etc. And this makes it, this creates the acceptance of the other in the self. This doesn't mean that there aren't minorities within this huge population of people of Muslim origin, which are several millions in France, that there aren't minorities which project jihad and violent actions and bombings. They exist, but they exist more or less in the same proportion as in other circumstances, except that the language that they find nowadays to express their aspirations is a language borrowed from extreme Islamic movements, which are not representatives of mainstream Islam, but which are dangerous and which have to be controlled by the means of police, but which shouldn't make us blame the whole population for what a few individuals perform.
Do you think that European Union countries or European Union as this super state actually has a strategy towards, has an answer on the questions of how to treat Islamic minorities within the country? Is this integration? Do we have to talk about it?
I don't think that the European Union should have special strategy for that. We should be very strict on the application of the law. The law is the same for all, but we should be tolerant in what concerns cultural differences, because in fact each one of us is already and necessarily a multicultural being, not just because we travel, but because culture is not only related to national differences or to linguistic differences. It is also related to our social milieu. And within a single day, we move, each one of us, from one milieu to another, and we switch, because of that, from one culture to another. I don't speak the same way when I speak to fellow people of my age and to youngsters of the age of my children or soon of my grandchildren. And we know how to adapt to these cultural differences. We also need some elements of a common culture, such as the language. I'm for the teaching of a common language when the language is not present in the life of minorities. I think that we should invest in teaching the common language to all the people who live on that territory, and that this investment will pay well enough in return. But I think that we should remain tolerant towards the fact that there is a different religion, just as Catholics and Protestants, instead of fighting the way they have done for centuries against each other, have become tolerant now with each other.
If we move to the last couple of questions, and then maybe someone in the public would also like to ask something. Do you think that Europe has got a problem with religion in general? That we are less tolerant towards Islam because of the enlightenment that the West has been going through, which, let's say, liberated us from some old patriarchal, archaic, also religious elements?
Well, first of all, the Enlightenment was not atheistic. It kept a certain idea of a natural religion, of deism, as they called it, a certain belief in a harmony of the world, which we may consider inappropriate, unacceptable if we stick to a more materialistic worldview. But at the time of the Enlightenment, it wasn't the dominant line of the Enlightenment was not against all religion. And there is a good illustration of this, which is the United States. The United States, where the population is in its huge majority religious, but the United States is a country based on the heritage of the Enlightenment. The founding fathers were inspired by Enlightenment principles.
But they found some interesting new mixture, this new solution with the state religion, which is a little bit different from, from the rest.
This is not a state religion in this case. In the United States, each man, each woman can have their own religion and not care about the other person's. But it so happens that they are religious. I think that indeed Europe nowadays is a kind of exception in the world at large. In general, the population of the world is religious. And the European population in its majority, not its entirety, but in its majority, is non-religious. So this is a strange situation. But I think that we have to remember that we were also Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox until just 20 or 30 years ago, and we shouldn't behave as such radical atheists that we should be shocked by the existence of beliefs around us. We also have beliefs which do not belong to a religion, but which frequently are just as stubborn and just as irrational, and which concern our everyday habits, the way we get dressed, paint our faces, or behave in public. We can be perceived as very strange creatures if we were seen from outside.
But so why do you then think that Europe so forcefully defends this barrier between religion and the state?
I think we are right to defend the non-religious nature of our state institutions. The Union as such, the European Union, is not, it doesn't have any religion. We were right not to include references to Christian religion,
in the Constitution.
Although it is in the Constitution, although it is clear that we were strongly influenced by the Christian religion, simply because we don't include all the elements that have influenced us in the past. But nowadays, we don't require any religion from anyone, but we tolerate the religion as a private individual practice. And we should remember that this has been the condition of the human species for the thousands and thousands of years that precede us. And we should be more humble in our conviction that we are superior to all the other nations.
Okay, let's see if there are any questions from the audience that can relate to anything that we were speaking about. Če je kakšno vprašanje, potem je zdaj čas, drugače bomo tudi končali pogovor. I was just saying that if there is no other question, then I will thank you for this. Please.
My emotion is a story that Catalonia will destroy Europe. Tell me, do you think it's possibility that Catalonia will become independent in the next 20 years? I remember from my emotion 20 years ago, t-shirts, you know, Catalonia loves Slovenia and Slovenia loves Catalonia 20 years ago. Do you have any opinion about that?
Well, I'm confronted with the Catalonian tendency towards independence because I go frequently to Barcelona. And in Barcelona, everything is written now in Catalan. And I hardly learned some Spanish, and I'm desperate now. My Spanish is to no use in Barcelona. I would say that I hope that Catalonia will not become independent, and Padania will not become independent in Italy. And because if each rich region wants to become independent, there is something of a selfish gene in that attitude. And since I am fond of the insistence on solidarity between members of a community, I would prefer that the rich don't leave us aside, and so that we remain just among the poor. But maybe this will become irrelevant if a stronger integration of Europe occurs, which is a possibility, although not an immediate project in the future, I must admit.
Anything else? Any other question? Then if not, I will just ask you one final question, I promise. Do you remember Europe, let's say 30 years ago, before European Community, European Union became everyday word? This was the extremely interesting continent full of mythological, historical differences. Of course, they all remain. They're very interesting. But at the same time, we hear this word Europe and European so often. They have this omnipresence over everything else that is going on. All the time we hear the same words. Do you sometimes miss the old Deutschmarks? Do you miss the situation when you go to Prague and you will buy something completely authentic there? You will not go to one of the international H&M or some other store. Do you think that Europe, because of all these connections, is losing some of its potent power in a way?
Well, maybe you hear the word Europe more frequently here than in France. The French are not so European-oriented. I remember that my publisher once told me, I was writing a book, as usual, and the publisher told me, please don't put the word Europe in the title. I said, why? Well, because it won't sell at all. Nobody buys books with Europe in a title. I don't know if this is true in Slovenia. Maybe it's the other way around. But so I don't suffer from what you mentioned here. But I certainly have no nostalgia for the French franc and the German marks. And I feel very proud to go in a different country and to see that we have some material artifacts in common. I am an incorrigible European. And I know that we may lose something, but I think that we have the way of keeping our cultural plurality within a single collective political project. And we shouldn't confuse the two. The project is political because we live in a world where our small nations will be necessarily submitted to larger nations. And because of that, it is in our interest to act politically together. But we shouldn't erode at all our culture. And I was telling to some of the people I just met today that last week I was in a public meeting which was devoted to Slovenian culture in France. And I didn't know that I was going to be in such a meeting because it was just called on European literatures. But it so happened, to my great surprise, that it was on Slovenian literature. And if we hadn't, and if there hadn't been a European Union, I don't think this would have happened. And so I wouldn't have read this last week the writings of a Maribor writer called Drago Jančar, which I did. I think that's a plus in terms of culture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tzvetan Todorov, for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.